All right, it's WrestleMania 40 week here at Wrestling Reaction. We continue our look at some of the big matches on the card, both for night one and night two. And we get to this one, which is brother versus brother in brotherly love. The city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, is going to get Jey Uso versus Jimmy Uso one-on-one, the much anticipated singles match. And that's an interesting phrase because this was never supposed to happen. And I'm going to explain why. Think about these two guys and how long they have sort of been in the WWE system, right? They started back in FCW, Florida Championship Wrestling, 2010. That's a long time ago. And you think about all the people who have come and gone since then, whether it's, leaving WWE for somewhere else, all this, like, it's just not very often you see guys that can stick around for this long and ultimately get to this point where they're having a singles match. And one of the reasons is it felt like there was always a ceiling. Under the previous regime, when you're in a tag team, it felt like there was kind of always a ceiling with certain guys, and you ever wondered, were they ever going to break out and have a chance to kind of go off on their own, establish themselves as unique sort of characters on the weekly WWE television? Or are they just always going to be known as, hey, that's, that person's tag team partner. They're a tag team. We're never going to be able to see them as anything other than a tag team. There was a time there where I think you looked at Jimmy and Jey and wondered, were you ever going to really be able to see them as anything other than just tag team partners? Obviously, twin brothers. Could we see them as anything else? But once you started to kind of get into that feud where you had them in the New Day, right? And I think you started to see some things there where it brought out the best in both teams, and you really started to understand, hey, these guys are probably better than anybody wants to give them credit for. And then you started having the conversations about, hey, could they be the best tag team of all time in WWE when you look at their accomplishments, all this other stuff. But it's one thing to talk about that and then get things to a point where you're having a featured match, not just an undercard, nothing match, an actual featured match that you've been building and building and building for a long time now on a WrestleMania card, and what could be the biggest WrestleMania of all time. But here we are with Jey and Jimmy. They are here about to embark on something that we've not seen a lot in WWE. Obviously, Bret Hart versus Owen Hart, the most memorable one that there's been, with two brothers facing off at WrestleMania, and one of the best WrestleMania matches ever. Jeff Hardy versus Matt Hardy. That one probably not as memorable as the Bret versus Owen one, but it was for some part of the fans because it were all the people who supported the Hardy Boys and saw them as one of the greatest tag teams of all time. It was a big match to finally see it that way. This one, though, does feel a little bit different in that, if you would have done the predictability of a Bret versus Owen match, a Matt versus Jeff match, and a Jey versus Jimmy match, this one would have probably been third on the list. If you would have gone back to the bulk of their career, at some point, you would have said, we could see those two happening, right? But this one, until the bloodline came along, this was something where you just never thought you were going to see it. And you never thought that WWE would go this route. But that's also where the change in leadership and what has happened now, I think Triple H is someone, and we've talked about this in other videos, he has really placed the value on making everyone feel different and unique. And everyone has their own motivations, right? Whereas before, you could look at tag teams and situations where you're like, all right, hey, let's look at these two guys. There's nothing different, right? We're just going to assume they both have the same motivations, they both have the same personality, all this other stuff. But Triple H, I think one of his biggest strengths when it comes to just watching how WWE has evolved since he's been in charge is the ability to make it very clear that everyone has different motivations and everyone has certain goals that they want to achieve. Jey Uso has become main event Jey Uso. Jimmy has unfortunately kind of gone back to just being sort of the lackey for the bloodline. But there's something in there in that story that has caused Jimmy to go back there. Now, I will say, I will call it what it is. That, I think, has been one of the weaker part of the bloodline storylines. Not Jimmy himself, but the reasoning behind Jimmy going back and kind of playing into what came after the singles match between Roman Reigns and Jey Uso last year. That's been one of the weaker points. But we'll set that aside for just a second to kind of applaud what we are actually getting here and the fact that, again, this was a match that the numbers tell you probably always was going to be an underdog and actually happening. But it's not, and again, this is where we've seen these two set off on their separate ways. And I think one of the best things they could have done was what they did by putting Jey Uso on Raw, leaving Jey Uso on SmackDown with the Bloodline with Roman Reigns, which is kind of blended together on the road to WrestleMania 40. But it has allowed Jey to shine, right? Like he's main event Jey Uso. It's allowed him to put together a catchphrase that everyone's saying. They're selling shirts, they're doing all this other stuff. You're pushing Jey now as a legitimate singles guy, even though, not really had that championship triumph just yet, but you're pushing him as a guy who can stand on his own. He doesn't need Jimmy to be able to do that. Now, you could say it's maybe a little bit tougher for Jimmy because they haven't gone in that same direction yet with him. And so maybe it's a little bit more of a challenge. But I think when the Bloodline came along, this is where, you could not have asked for a better setup for these two guys and to play into the story the way they have, which again is why the Bloodline storyline has been as successful. Sure, Roman Reigns had a ton to do with it. There's no doubt. Paul Heyman's had a ton to do with it. But there have been a lot of memorable moments throughout this Bloodline story that have involved these two. These two guys who are going to set off on a course now to face each other at WrestleMania 40. And I think, again, you go back in kind of the history of WWE, where how many times were there people where it just seemed like they were viewed as they're a tag team, they're the same guy, they have the same personality, there's nothing that separates them. And I always worried that was kind of going to be the case for Jimmy and Jey Uso. Were they ever going to get to a point where they're anything other than, hey, these guys are one of those tag team lifers, and that's just the way it works. They're never going to get that opportunity. We just don't see enough in them. You always wondered, was that the conversation? But again, it's where sometimes all it takes is that one game-changing storyline, which the Bloodline storyline has been for WWE. A complete game changer can come along and change the entire outlook that you had on a certain wrestler, on a certain tag team. And I think their ability to have some of the singles matches, right, early on, where you had, Jimmy and Jey involved and Reigns and all this, like, to kind of make them such a big part of the entire Bloodline presentation. Hey, can they thank Roman Reigns for some of this? Absolutely. But I think you also kind of have to applaud the ability of these two guys to be able to put themselves now in a position where they can deliver a match of a lifetime for themselves, getting that one-on-one match as brothers at WrestleMania, which, like we said, is not something that has happened very often in WWE. And I think this is one that, if you're betting and you're trying to find, the odds for this one for many, many years was very low that this would ever happen. And be something, again, not just maybe ever happen, be something of this magnitude where you feel like whoever wins this match, the outcome is going to play into Roman Reigns probably on night 2 in the main event against Cody Rhodes. So I think that is something too, where you just think about what these guys have done and the positions they've been put in. And like I said, look, one of the weaker parts of this, I think, is questioning the whole Jimmy thing and going back to Roman and all that. But there is some sort of character motivation there. I don't know that they've spelled it out as much as we would have liked, but there's something there, and there's clearly a side of Jey who wanted to finally break away and be done with the Bloodline. Of course, we had the memorable moment where he's like, you're out, I'm out too. That was one of the most defining moments of this entire thing and how we've led to this point now where, you've got Roman, you've got Solo, but Jimmy just kind of feels like he's there, but what is it? Like, what is it that's keeping him there? Like, those are still things that I think have to be solved. But nonetheless, I think this is one where I could see the upset with Jimmy getting the win, and then somehow Jey gets his revenge while all the other stuff's going on around them in that Roman Reigns versus Cody match on night 2. But there's also a situation where do you want to just give Jey kind of that shining singles win here? Because, there were some criticism of the Jey versus Roman match last year at SummerSlam, and this is a big match for these two. I think to prove it on this kind of stage that they can have a singles match that takes both coming out of it being in a much better position. And, look, you think about this, right? How many years of their life have these two guys been thinking about this opportunity, this chance to fight each other in a one-on-one match at WrestleMania? It's like one of those things, too, where you're like, hey, we always love to fantasy book. We love to think about, what if that guy hit that move then and did all that? These guys have been thinking about spots, moves, and everything probably for most of their entire adult lives at this point. If we ever get there, if we ever get that chance, we remember this thing we talked about in 2016? Boom, we're going to use that spot 100%. Remember that thing we did in 2013? Oh, yeah, we got to use that too. So I'm excited for this one. I know a lot of people, look, it's easy to do these days. Just criticize everything and just say, hey, the story has been a little lackluster with Jimmy. Why did he go back to the bloodline? All that. The match with Jey and Roman didn't deliver as people thought maybe last year. But I'm excited for this because I understand how hard it was probably to ever get to this point. I mean, look, there were times where, like I said, these two have been in WWE for the longest time. I mean, look, there were out-of-the-ring stuff with Jimmy going on. You never knew, was this going to be something that could actually be a reality? And I think now that we see that these two guys are in the position they're in, and Triple H has now put them in a spot where they have a chance to try to steal the show at WrestleMania 40, one of the biggest WrestleManias of all time. I mean, what more could you ask for if you're Jey and Jimmy Uso? Like, this is the chance you've been waiting on your entire professional wrestling career. This is it. This is the chance to do everything you've ever wanted to do and have a very memorable moment with your brother inside, a wrestling ring and do it on the biggest stage of them all. And so, yeah, I mean, I think this is just an incredible accomplishment. If nothing else, this is an incredible thing that these two guys have achieved to get to this point. And I'm okay with that. Like, I don't feel like I have to be overly critical, like, about all the stuff that's led here. Maybe if you haven't liked some of the storyline twists and, all that stuff, whatever. Like, I mean, again, wrestling's supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to, sometimes you're supposed to look at it with a different lens. This is one I look at just thinking, man, did we ever think this would actually happen pre-Bloodline? Did we ever think this was going to be a match that was going to be this far up the card and be this important heading into a WrestleMania season? And yet here we are, and there's part of me that thinks Jimmy's going to win to tie in to Jey's revenge, like everybody else trying to get revenge potentially in that Cody-Roman match. Also a part of me that wonders, did we just get Jey straight up over Jimmy here? And maybe that also plays into somehow the finish of that. I have no doubt whatever happens here, it's going to play into what probably happens with Cody and Reigns on night 2. But there you go. There's some thoughts on this match that we never maybe thought would happen many years ago as you're watching WWE, seeing the Usos as a tag team, thinking, hey, is that what they're always going to be? Nope, because here they are with a featured singles match on WrestleMania 40. So let me know your thoughts on this match heading into it. What do you think? What's the outcome going to be? Jey and Jimmy one-on-one for the first time at WrestleMania. What do you think? How's it going to unfold? Hit the subscribe button. Lots of videos this week and a lot of other videos previously looking at all the stuff with the Bloodline, what could happen on the road to the two big matches, The Rock and Roman Reigns versus Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins, and Cody Rhodes versus Roman Reigns as well. So appreciate you guys watching as always. Love the feedback. Let me know what you think about this match. The unthinkable match, the one we never thought we'd get to. Improbable odds. Jey Uso versus Jimmy Uso.